Welcome back to Power and Politics. We're back with the Power Panel, David, Melissa, Andrew, and Marika. The Toronto Star's Rob Benzie reported yesterday that there has been discord within Ontario Premier Doug Ford's caucus, much of it stemming from tensions with Ford's Chief of Staff, Dean French. Sources are quoted as saying there's a culture of fear, it's like the KGB, and that, quote, MPPs are treated as if they're lower than the staff. These are not the first reports of conflict between Dean French and PC MPPs. Melissa, I'll start with you. How significant is what Mr. Benzie is reporting, do you think?
Look, I think that not calling it significant certainly would do a disservice. I think it is significant, and I think what the government needs to do is take the time off, take the 5 months to recalibrate. We know about, and I'm sure we'll talk about, a shuffle that's impending. To take the time to reset, to elevate those who deserve to be elevated, maybe to shed some weight or rejig some portfolios. In a way that lets them focus on governing going forward. I think it's been a tough first year, and a lot of it stems from a populism versus a conservatism that I'm not sure anybody really recognizes.
What do you mean by that?
So what I mean is I think that you have a populist premier that's not necessarily ready to make some of the tough conservative choices that they've been making on finding the efficiencies and cutting the budget. And I think those, there's two factions right there in the government that are certainly fighting it out, and going forward, they're going to have to figure out which one wins the day.
Andrew, is a cabinet shuffle enough to sort of reset things, or is there a larger problem, I guess, with, according to that report, at least Dean French and his relationship, or the way in which a lot of these MPPs reportedly feel?
So there are certainly some issues between the Premier's office and the caucus, but I think that they're overstated in terms of how much of division there is between the Premier's office and the rest of the government apparatus. The government offices, the ministers, are still pretty much in sync from what we can tell. I think what I sense has happened is that they're just surprised at how unpopular their decisions were. They really didn't expect this, and there is certainly, I think, a great divide about how the budget has been developed and sold, not so much on the decisions within it, but certainly on the communications around it, and who's taking the blame for that. From what we're hearing, is still pretty much a big debate. But doing a cabinet shuffle is a pretty bold way to show that you've gotten the message and you're prepared to learn from it. I think what people are going to look for from the shuffle is what happens to some of the big names, where do they end up, does it change the tone, and does this give the government an opportunity to go back and do what they should have done after they were immediately elected, and that's reconnect with the stakeholders and people in constituencies to explain what they think is going to happen going forward.
If there have been, Marika, communication issues around the budget, and obviously some of the fallout that we've seen since that budget, who takes the blame if there is a cabinet shuffle?
Well, that's really what is happening behind the scenes right now. Benzie's article also sort of alluded to this power struggle that we're seeing between Peter Bethlenfalvy, Vic Fideli, and other actors within the government. And it really is in part about taking the blame and seeing, where that lands. But I also think that there's more going on here, because Caucus, from the people I talk to in Caucus, are also very unhappy with how this rolled out. And so there is an anger that needs to be addressed some way. I think we'll get a sense of what message they're actually trying to send with the cabinet shuffle. I mean, the government still hasn't said when's coming, but everybody else does. By how big it is and how big of a deal the government itself makes of it. And if we do see big names moving, then I think you really will see an attempt at a true reset. Otherwise, I think it's just sort of rejigging around the margins.
David, you've been in cabinet, you've been in government. When you look at what might have to happen to quote unquote reset, what are you thinking?
Well, I've been through what's going on in Ontario right now. And one thing, a chief of staff almost always by definition is the bad cop. And usually what this signals is that there isn't enough cohesion in the caucus. Remember, Doug Ford became leader of this party a few months before the election. Has this team really had time to coalesce and become one united front? So you may need people to actually come in and be sort of that buffer between the Premier's office and the caucus itself. But what also, sure, a shuffle is a good move, but it's what you do after. What kind of policies you implement right away? not in another year, because if you do a shuffle and bring in new people, and that's also what you're hearing right now. What I'm hearing also, when you have unhappy caucus members, remember, these caucus members want to become ministers too. And so they're sending messages as well. So the idea here is if you bring in a lot of new people that have never been ministers, the problem with that is you may not get the policy shifts you need right away. So you need to be able to accompany them with a shuffle, along with the shuffle rather, so they can implement new policies right away.
If
That's why
yeah, go ahead, sir.
the cabinet. That's why it can't be it's not really a silver bullet, right? Because if it's about communications, then a cabinet shuffle doesn't. In some ways, it addresses that because you shift your better communicators to other portfolios. But there's a huge apparatus behind these ministers that make a lot of these decisions, and so there is much more that has to happen if they want this reset than just the shuffle.
But they'll do a lot of that at the same time. I mean, this was what will happen. Chiefs of staff will start to move. Stakeholder directors will move. You'll end up with new policy people coming in and out. It becomes, an impetus for making more change. I do think it's important, though, that people remember two things about it from the Ontario context. Number one, we're still 3 years away from an election. There's lots of runway for this government to reset. Second, there's still a pretty bad taste in people's mouths about the last government. And although they may not be happy with the particular change that we've got right now, there's still an understanding there needed to be a change from what there was. And so there's no great rush to either one of the opposition parties at this point to change things. And I think this is why Ford does have a few options available to him to actually get a proper reset done.
Building on what Andrew said, they've made a lot of the tough decisions in year one. They've made a lot of those tough cuts to get the spending down. Remember, you had 15 years of governments that would just spend more and more every single year. So of course there wasn't any discord in caucus. They were all getting exactly what they wanted and the pet projects in their ridings. That doesn't seem to be the case here. So caucus management becomes a bigger issue, and you can't manage caucus by giving money to some water filtration plant or cleaning up a lake. You have to manage caucus the old-fashioned way.
But doesn't that speak to the tension? I'm so interested in what you described as the tension between a premier who has such populist tendencies and that conservative ideology. Like when you're, obviously we've seen that tension when you see some of those cuts rolled back more than once. So what happens going forward? Like how do you navigate that? How do you manage that?
So I think there's a recognition there that tension absolutely exists and exists between the premier and many members of the caucus. And of course there are members of the caucus that agree with the premier. But these walkbacks or U-turns on some of the cuts that happened, be it on autism or be it with municipalities, suggests that the premier is engaged and he's listening, and the government could probably use a little bit more Doug Ford in it.
I'm also hearing, though, that a lot of people aren't really happy with the idea of the walkbacks. That there are a lot of people who felt that when the caucus had finally kind of signed off and cabinet signed off on the budget, they should have stuck with it. And that the problem has been, in fact, one of tone and one of communication. The other piece that we certainly kind of sense is that there's a lot of different factions within the Conservative caucus. And certainly that was my experience serving in government too. It's not always just two sides to this. So there are a lot of different groups. There's a dynamic group of young MPPs who are looking for a way to get in. There's a group of more senior ministers who have been kind of marginalized in their portfolios. They're not the five faces in front of the camera. And there's a sense that maybe those who are there haven't quite carried it out right. Not to say that this isn't a battle between the forces of populism and conservative ideology, but I do think that this is a pretty complex space. The question will be, and I think this is one of the other issues, will the Premier take advantage of this as an opportunity to move or to clip the wings a little bit of French as a Chief of Staff?
Okay, I gotta go, but thank you very much to the Power Panel this evening. Thanks to David Hertel, Melissa Lantzman, Andrew Thompson, and Marika Walsh. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.